In a 19th century courtroom, the judge, the lawyers, and every member of the jury were men. Historically, the law reserved only two roles for a woman: a silent victim or a condemned sinner waiting for the rope. But there were rare moments when a woman, backed completely into a corner, decided not to wait for the mercy of a court that was never built for her. Instead of waiting for justice, she simply took the weapon into her own hands. These are the stories of three women who refused to die quietly and rewrote the rules entirely. In the spring of 1872, the industrial machinery of New York City was deafening. Behind the brick walls of the city's factories, the air was thick with cotton dust, sweat, and the relentless, rhythmic pounding of mechanical looms. It was a world that swallowed the young and the poor, offering them meager wages in exchange for their youth and their lungs. In this suffocating environment, a 15-year-old girl named Fanny Hyde spent her days. She was just one of countless young women trapped in an endless cycle of exhausting labor, her life dictated by the factory whistle and the demands of men who viewed her as little more than property. The man who controlled that particular corner of Fanny's world was George W. Watson. As an employer, Watson held absolute authority over the factory floor. He was a man accustomed to taking what he wanted, operating with the impunity that came from wealth and gender in the Victorian era. For Fanny, the nightmare did not begin with a single, sudden act of violence. It began with the heavy, unmistakable sound of Watson's footsteps approaching her workstation. It began with lingering touches that she could not refuse, whispered threats she could not report, and a systematic campaign of coercion that isolated her completely. He made it clear, through both word and action, that her employment, her reputation, and her very survival depended entirely on her submission to his desires. The law in 1872 offered Fanny no shield. The concept of protecting female workers from sexual exploitation did not exist in the legal statutes of New York, nor in the moral vocabulary of the men who wrote them. A factory girl who complained of harassment would not find justice. She would find herself unemployed, destitute, and branded as a woman of loose morals. The arithmetic of the era was brutal and simple. Watson was a respectable businessman. Fanny was a replaceable factory hand. Society had already decided whose word mattered. And so, Fanny endured. She endured the harassment, the abuse, and the suffocating terror of Watson's constant presence. The abuse stretched on for years, transforming her adolescence into a prolonged state of captivity. She walked through the noisy, dusty factory every morning, knowing exactly what awaited her, carrying a burden of silence that grew heavier with every passing month. But silence, no matter how deeply enforced, is not infinite. There is a precise moment when the human mind, having been backed into a dark corner for too long, stops looking for a way out and starts looking for a weapon. By April of 1872, Fanny had been pushed to the absolute limit of her psychological endurance. The threats had escalated. The coercion had become a daily torment that left her with nowhere left to retreat. It was during this desperate period that a profound realization settled over her. She understood, with the terrifying clarity of the doomed, that the system was working exactly as it was designed to. The police would not save her. The courts would not hear her. The law was constructed to protect men like George W. Watson, to ensure their comfort, their wealth, and their unchecked dominion over the women who worked beneath them. If she wanted to survive, she would have to step outside the boundaries of a society that had already abandoned her. The breaking point arrived not with a scream, but with the cold, deliberate click of a mechanism. The details of that final confrontation were brief and violent, stripping away years of forced obedience in a matter of seconds. When the heavy footsteps approached her one last time, Fanny Hyde did not lower her eyes. She did not submit. Instead, the loud, chaotic noise of the factory floor was suddenly pierced by the sharp, definitive crack of a gunshot. The bullet found its mark. George W. Watson, the man who had controlled her life through terror and authority, collapsed to the floor. Dead, the machinery around her kept churning, indifferent to the blood pooling on the wooden floorboards. The other workers froze in absolute shock, but Fanny Hyde dropped her hands. She did not run. She waited for the police, because for the first time in her life, she was ready to speak. When the trial of Fanny Hyde opened in Brooklyn, the courtroom was packed far beyond its physical capacity. Reporters from every major newspaper crowded the front rows, their pens ready to capture the scandalous details of a young female worker who had dared to gun down her affluent employer. Spectators filled the wooden benches and stood pressed shoulder to shoulder against the walls. To the polite society of 1872 New York, the industrial mills were a separate, invisible world, a dark and distant machinery hidden away behind thick brick walls. But as this trial commenced, the heavy courtroom doors were forced wide open, allowing the soot, the sweat, and the dirty, unspoken secrets of Victorian industrialism to spill out directly onto the public record. Fanny sat quietly at the defense table. She was no longer a nameless hand at a loom, but the inescapable center of a very public reckoning. The testimony that followed over the ensuing weeks was shocking, not for the mechanical details of the shooting itself, but for everything that had preceded it. Witnesses and legal arguments painted a vivid, horrifying picture of George W. Watson's absolute reign over his female employees. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as the intricate mechanics of his coercion were laid bare. The narrative quickly shifted from a simple act of murder to a grim chronicle of sustained, systematic predation. The jury heard exactly how Watson had isolated Fanny since she was 15, how he cornered her in the stairwells, and how he weaponized the threat of starvation and total social ruin to bend her to his will. He had effectively transformed the factory floor into a private hunting ground, operating with the absolute assurance that men of his economic station were safely beyond the reach of any consequence. The prosecution argued fiercely that Watson was the victim, but the relentless facts presented in court began to tell an entirely different story about who was truly being hunted in that factory. In 19th century legal proceedings, the standard defense for a woman who committed murder was temporary insanity, a plea that relied heavily on the era's deep-seated assumptions about inherent female fragility. Fanny's defense attorneys deliberately chose a different path. They did not beg the court for mercy, nor did they attempt to portray her as a hysterical child who did not fully understand the gravity of her actions. Instead, they took direct aim at the profound hypocrisy of a society that allowed predators like Watson to operate completely unchecked. They argued with fierce conviction that Fanny had simply exercised the fundamental right of self-defense, a right that was traditionally and exclusively reserved for men protecting their own physical property. Why, they asked the jury, should a working-class woman not have the exact same right to defend her own bodily autonomy? If the law of New York provided absolutely no shield for the vulnerable women turning the massive wheels of its industry, who could possibly condemn a girl for forging her own? The final decision rested in the hands of an all-male jury. Under the strict, unforgiving letter of the law, Fanny Hyde had committed premeditated murder. The societal expectation was a swift conviction, followed by a sentence of death by hanging. But the 12 men in the jury box had been forced to listen to the brutal reality of her life. They deliberated for hours, weighing the visible blood on Fanny's hands against the invisible, suffocating chains Watson had wrapped around her for years. When they finally returned to the courtroom, they announced they were hopelessly deadlocked. It was a hung jury. The prosecution simply could not find 12 men willing to send her to the gallows for killing her tormentor. Ultimately, the charges were dropped, and Fanny Hyde walked out of the courthouse as a free woman. It was an unprecedented victory, a massive structural crack in the rigid architecture of Victorian justice. Fanny had escaped her physical prison, but a few years earlier, another woman had to shoot her way out of an entirely different kind of trap, one invisible to the naked eye. In 1865, Washington, D.C. was a city exhaling from the profound exhaustion of the American Civil War. The physical battlefields of the South had finally gone quiet, but the bureaucratic heart of the capital was louder and more ruthless than ever. The United States Treasury Building stood as a towering monument to this new era of cold, administrative power, a massive fortress of stone, marble, and political influence. It was a place designed exclusively for men of consequence, a labyrinth where the futures of states and industries were decided behind closed doors. It was certainly not a place for someone like Mary Harris. She was barely 20 years old, far removed from the safety of her family, entirely naive to the vicious, transactional undercurrents of the capital, and profoundly alone in a city that preyed on the vulnerable. The architect of her isolation was a man named Adoniram J. Burroughs. Burroughs was an older, deeply entrenched government official who navigated the polished corridors of the Treasury with the arrogant ease of a man who knew his own untouchable status. When he first approached Mary, he presented himself as a worldly guardian and a steadfast protector, eventually securing her absolute trust and her promise of marriage. In the strict social arithmetic of the 19th century, an engagement to a man of his standing was not merely a romance. It was a young woman's only viable guarantee of financial and social survival. His proposal felt like a permanent anchor in a chaotic world. But the promise was an elaborate fiction. When Burroughs inevitably tired of the arrangement, he did not simply walk away and leave her to rebuild her life. He chose instead to systematically eradicate her. The cruelty he unleashed upon her was entirely psychological, executed with the dark precision of a seasoned predator. Burroughs understood perfectly that in the polite, unforgiving society of 1865, a woman's reputation was her single, fragile currency. Once it was spent, she was destitute. Utilizing his significant age gap, his professional leverage, and his vast network of acquaintances, he began to dismantle Mary's character from the shadows. He intercepted her private correspondence, planted insidious rumors about her morality, and effectively poisoned the well of her social connections. The betrayal was quiet and absolute. Friends suddenly stopped calling. Respectable boarding houses claimed to have no vacancies when she arrived. Burroughs constructed an invisible, suffocating prison around her, ensuring that everywhere Mary turned, she found doors quietly locking just before she could reach the handle. He manipulated her reality so thoroughly and relentlessly that she began to lose her grip on her own sanity. As Mary watched her life dissolve into a waking nightmare of paranoia and social exile, a terrible, isolating realization took hold. If Burroughs had struck her across the face, there would be a physical bruise to present to a magistrate. If he had stolen her jewelry, there would be a missing ledger to bring before a judge. But the profound wounds he inflicted did not bleed. In the eyes of 19th century jurisprudence, a wound without blood simply did not exist. The legal system of the era was built to protect property and physical safety. It was completely, structurally blind to the concept of psychological torture. Mary realized she was being murdered from the inside out. The man holding the knife was walking freely through the grandest halls of the federal government, shielded completely by his gender, his position, and the glaring limitations of the law. She was not going to simply fade into madness and obscurity. On a quiet afternoon, Mary Harris walked up the sweeping steps and through the heavy doors of the Treasury building. She moved deliberately through the echoing corridors of power, a small, marginalized figure stepping straight into the epicenter of the man who had ruined her. She found Adoniram J. Burroughs exactly where he belonged, surrounded by the trappings of his authority. There was no dramatic argument. There was no final, tearful plea for the mercy he had spent months denying her. Mary simply drew a pistol from her garments and fired. The sharp, deafening crack of the gunshot echoed violently against the marble walls, shattering the polite bureaucratic silence. Burroughs collapsed to the floor, his absolute power suddenly meaningless. The gun smoke cleared in the hallways of the Treasury, but the real battlefield was about to be the human mind. The subsequent murder trial in the summer of 1865 gripped a capital city that was still deeply scarred by the bloodshed of the Civil War. When Mary Harris was brought before the court in Washington, D.C., the overwhelming weight of public opinion was heavily stacked against her. Adoniram J. Burroughs had been a prominent, respected figure within the Treasury Department, a man whose political utility and social standing made him a martyr in the eyes of the establishment. To the press and the polite elite society of the capital, Mary was nothing more than a hysterical, scorned woman who had committed a brazen, cold-blooded assassination in a federal building. The prosecution's case was incredibly straightforward and seemingly bulletproof. The shooting was conducted in broad daylight, witnessed by several people in the hallways of power, and undeniably premeditated. By all traditional legal standards of the 19th century, the trial was viewed as a mere formality before a swift execution. But Mary's defense attorney, a brilliant and fiercely theatrical lawyer named Daniel W. Voorhees, understood that fighting the prosecution on the physical facts of the shooting was a guaranteed death sentence. Voorhees stepped before the jury box and deliberately abandoned every conventional legal strategy available to him. He did not attempt to deny that Mary held the pistol on that quiet afternoon. He did not deny that she had stalked Burroughs into the Treasury, nor did he deny that she pulled the trigger. Instead, Voorhees systematically shifted the courtroom's attention away from the blood on the marble floor and directed it straight into the dark, unseen mechanics of emotional abuse. In a mesmerizing address that would go down in American legal history, Voorhees laid bare the intricate anatomy of Mary's psychological destruction. Though the clinical vocabulary for emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and psychological trauma would not officially exist for another century, Voorhees articulated the concept with devastating clarity. He presented the court with the intercepted letters, the shattered promises of marriage, and the calculated social isolation that Burroughs had orchestrated. Voorhees passionately argued that this was not a case of a woman seeking petty revenge, but a case of premeditated murder committed by Burroughs himself. Voorhees framed the narrative to show that Burroughs had systematically poisoned Mary's mind, stripping away her reputation, her sanity, and her future until absolutely nothing remained of the innocent girl she had once been. According to the defense, Burroughs had effectively killed Mary Harris from the inside out long before she ever set foot in that federal building. When the fatal gunshot finally echoed through the Treasury, Mary was merely pulling the trigger of a weapon her tormentor had loaded with his own cruelty. The courtroom, initially hostile and entirely dismissive of the young defendant, fell into a stunned, profound silence. Voorhees had taken a deeply patriarchal legal system, one that historically only recognized physical wounds and stolen property, and forced it to confront the devastating reality of psychological trauma. The all-male jury listened to the agonizing timeline of her manipulation, and against all societal expectations and legal precedents, they understood it. After a period of tense deliberation, the jury returned to the packed courtroom and delivered a verdict of not guilty. It was a monumental, unprecedented legal triumph. For the first time in American history, a court of law had implicitly recognized the invisible, crushing weight of emotional abuse as a legitimate factor for a woman pushed beyond the brink of human endurance. Mary Harris walked out of the courtroom alive, having successfully turned the law against the very men who thought they controlled it. Harris and Hyde fired bullets to win their freedom. But 50 years later, a group of women would fight an enemy that a bullet could never stop. In the early 1920s, the industrial landscape of New Jersey was painted with the glittering promise of modern progress. It was a time of rapid scientific advancement and booming corporate enterprise, a world away from the dusty, deafening textile mills of the previous century. In the studios of the United States Radium Corporation, a young woman named Grace Fryer sat alongside dozens of other girls, engaging in work that felt both lucrative and glamorous. They were painting the dials of watches with a newly patented luminous paint, a miraculous substance that glowed brightly in the dark. The factory floor was quiet, meticulous, and seemingly safe. But this quietness was profoundly deceptive. When the young women walked home through the darkening streets of New Jersey, their clothes, their hands, and even their hair emitted a pale, ghostly luminescence. They were celebrated as the Ghost Girls, laughing as they painted their teeth and fingernails with the glowing liquid for evening dances. They had absolutely no idea that the magical substance illuminating their youth was methodically consuming them alive. The United States Radium Corporation knew exactly what it was doing. While the corporate executives and scientists wore heavy lead aprons and handled the radium with long specialized tongs, the female dial painters were explicitly instructed to use their own lips to point the tips of their camel hair brushes. It was a technique designed purely for corporate efficiency, saving the company time and resources while depositing microscopic amounts of deadly radiation directly into the bodies of the workers. When the women began to fall ill, the collapse of their physical bodies was as terrifying as it was absolute. It started with an agonizing toothache. Then, their jawbones began to literally crumble inside their mouths, honeycombed by the radioactive decay. Their spines snapped under their own weight. As the death toll quietly mounted, the corporation did not halt production or offer medical aid. Instead, they launched a massive campaign of systemic deception. They paid off medical professionals to diagnose the dying women with syphilis, intentionally ruining their reputations to deflect corporate liability. When the truth became impossible to bury, US Radium deployed a battery of expensive, high-powered lawyers to drown the surviving workers in endless legal delays. The strategy was incredibly cruel, but mathematically sound. They simply planned to drag the litigation out until every single plaintiff was dead. For Grace Fryer, the agonizing deterioration of her own body brought with it a stark, psychological revelation. She watched her friends being buried in lead-lined coffins, and she understood that waiting for corporate morality or legislative mercy was a guaranteed death sentence. The legal system, heavily weighted in favor of industrial giants, was perfectly content to watch them expire in silence. Grace realized that she could not shoot a corporation in a hallway, nor could she simply walk away from an enemy that was already nested deep inside her own bones. If she wanted any semblance of justice, she would have to wage a completely different kind of war. Despite wearing a cumbersome steel brace to support her failing spine, and despite the relentless intimidation from US Radium's legal team, Grace chose to fight. In 1928, alongside 4 other terminally ill dial painters, she dragged the corporation into federal court. They were taking on one of the most powerful industrial entities in the country, armed with nothing but their own decaying bodies as evidence. They were given only months to live. So they decided to spend those months tearing down an empire. By the time the hearings officially opened in the early months of 1928, the federal courtroom did not resemble a traditional theater of American justice. It looked like a hospice. The plaintiffs who had filed the suit were no longer the vibrant, energetic girls who had once painted watch dials on a bustling factory floor. They had become living ghosts. Grace Fryer and her co-plaintiffs were physically incapable of walking to the witness stand. Some were entirely bedridden, unable to even raise their right hands to swear the judicial oath. They had to be carried into the courtroom, offering their harrowing testimonies from the confines of stretchers and wheelchairs. The visual impact was devastating. The attending press documented every agonizing detail: the shattered jaws, the failing, brittle limbs, and the hollow, exhausted eyes of young women who were quietly suffocating from the inside out. Across the aisle sat the impeccably dressed defense attorneys for the United States Radium Corporation. Men paid handsomely to represent an empire built on the very poison that was currently executing the women in front of them. The legal strategy deployed by US. Radium was not designed to prove their innocence, largely because the medical truth was already an undeniable matter of scientific record. Instead, their strategy was a masterclass in corporate attrition. Knowing perfectly well that the women had been given only months to live, the corporation's legal team filed endless motions, requested continuous postponements, and weaponized the bureaucratic slowness of the judicial system. They argued that their expert witnesses were momentarily unavailable, or that they needed additional months to properly review the complex medical files. The underlying arithmetic of their defense was utterly barbaric. If they could successfully delay the proceedings for just a little while longer, the plaintiffs would finally succumb to the radiation. The lawsuit would effectively die with them, and the corporation's massive profit margins would remain untouched. They were not fighting a legal battle over facts. They were simply running out the clock on human lives. But the corporation had profoundly miscalculated the absolute power of dying women who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Grace Fryer refused to expire quietly in the shadows. Despite her unimaginable physical agony, her mind remained exceptionally sharp, and her fierce determination to expose the company ignited a massive firestorm of public outrage. The press, initially hesitant to attack a major industrial employer, turned on US Radium with a vengeance. Front-page headlines across the nation broadcast the sheer, unabashed cruelty of the legal delays. Under mounting national pressure and faced with undeniable, independent medical evidence that definitively linked the women's decaying bones to the luminous paint, the legal barricades erected by the corporation finally collapsed. The court ruled decisively in favor of the Radium Girls. They were awarded immediate financial compensation, an annual pension, and full coverage of their mounting medical bills. Yet, the true victory of Grace Fryer and her courageous colleagues extended far beyond the wooden walls of that 1928 courtroom and far beyond the financial settlement they had secured. They knew the money could not save them. The radiation had already rewritten their cellular destiny, and they would all pass away shortly after the verdict was handed down. But in their final, agonizing months on Earth, these women achieved something historically unprecedented. Their lawsuit established the fundamental legal precedent that individual workers could sue corporations for occupational diseases. Their unimaginable suffering directly birthed the modern era of industrial safety, laying the crucial legislative groundwork for the eventual establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. The women who were poisoned by the glowing paint did not just win a lawsuit against a corporate giant. They forced the American legal system to recognize the absolute sanctity of a worker's life, effectively saving millions of men and women who would follow them onto the factory floors in the decades to come. The glowing hands of the dial painters eventually went completely still. But the heavy, undeniable truth they had forced into the light would never be buried again. When we look back across the span of 19th and early 20th century history, a striking and unsettling pattern emerges from the shadows of these courtrooms. The trajectory of a hard-won justice can be traced from the dust-choked floors of a Victorian textile mill in New York through the polished marble corridors of the United States Treasury in Washington, and finally to the solemn, heavy benches of a federal court in New Jersey. In each of these entirely different worlds, we find the exact same figure, a woman backed into a corner by men who wielded unchecked authority. Fanny Hyde, Mary Harris, and Grace Fryer were separated by decades, by social class, and by the specific nature of their tormentors. But they were ultimately bound together by a single, terrifying realization. The profound paradox of their eras was that the American legal system was never actually written to protect them. It was a vast, complex architecture constructed by men, for men, designed primarily to safeguard physical property and preserve the established social order. Within that rigid framework, the law did not view the sexual exploitation of a factory worker, the calculated psychological destruction of a young fiancé, or the systematic corporate poisoning of a dial painter as actionable crimes. The system was functioning exactly as it was intended to function. It was deliberately designed to keep women quietly confined to the role of the compliant, suffering victim. To survive in a world that fundamentally refused to acknowledge their pain, they had to commit the ultimate transgression. Because the law was entirely blind to their suffering, they chose not to wait for a mercy that was never coming. Instead, they shattered the boundaries of polite society, violently fractured the legal statutes of their time, and bent the moral arc of the courtroom until it finally recognized their humanity. They refused to die quietly in the shadows, and in doing so, they forced an entire nation to permanently remember their names. History rarely grants justice to those who simply wait for it in silence. Sometimes, when a woman is left standing alone before the looming specter of her own ruin, her only choice is to reach into the darkness and forge her own scythe.